Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer and this is the Norman Invasion, Part 15, The Conquest of Munster. By May 1177, the Normans had already conquered Leinster, Meath and Eastern Ulster, when King Henry II further granted the kingdoms of Desmond and Thomond in Munster to some of his liegemen. This signalled the beginning of a new wave of conquest in Ireland, and what became the enthralling Norman conquest of the southwest of Ireland. In telling this story, this episode is going to take a slightly different approach from previous shows. Many of you have pointed out in feedback that the series of the invasion heavily focuses on the Norman perspective. This is true and is largely reflective of the sources available to me. In this show, I have tried to make some redress and look at the events from a Gaelic perspective. The Gaelic reaction to the invasion of Munster is pretty unusual and definitely not what we might expect. To understand this, we need to look back at life in Munster in the previous decades to see what made people tick and why they reacted to the Normans in the way they did. This brings us deep into the world of blood feuds in medieval Ireland, a story that is not for the faint-hearted. By May 1177, Diarmaid MacCarthy, the King of South Munster, known in the medieval period as the Kingdom of Desmond, was a survivor, if nothing else. Diarmaid had navigated his way through the upheaval of the Norman invasion so far, but more importantly to him, he had also survived a ruthless feud. You see, Diarmaid had been born long before the invasion and grown up in a world where the Normans were no more than distant kings in England. In the Ireland of his youth, an especially bloody, age-old feud with the kings of North Munster, a region known as Thomond, had defined his perspective on life and the lives of generations of his ancestors. This feud was crucial to understanding how many in Munster reacted to the arrival of the Normans, so it's worth taking a closer look at it. Tensions between the MacCarthys of Desmond, that's Diarmaid's family, and the O'Briens, the ruling family of Thomond, were rooted way back in the 10th century. Now, distant as this was, it still had a lot of resonance in 1177. For Diarmaid and the MacCarthys, the O'Briens had robbed them of power. You see, the MacCarthys were descendants of one of the greatest families in medieval Irish history, the one-time early medieval kings of Munster, the O'Gaunacht of Cashel. At the height of their power, they had dominated the entire region. That was until the O'Briens had come along. In 908, Diarmaid's ancestors, the O'Gaunacht, had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Ballymoon. The reigning king, Cormac, and many of his dynasty had been killed. The family struggled in the following decades, facing one attack after another as chaos swept through Munster. In this maelstrom, a previously little heard of family, the Dál Cosh, began to rise up in North Munster. By 980, led by their powerful king, Brian Boru, they were dominating the entire region, including Diarmaid's ancestors, what would become the MacCarthys. Brian Boru eventually became one of the most powerful kings in Ireland, and his descendants took his name, calling themselves the O'Briens. In the following decades, the O'Briens' power increased as the MacCarthys faded and shrank back into Desmond or South Munster. In 1101, their demise was complete when an O'Brien king, Muirchertach, stripped them of their ancient fortress of the Rock of Cashel and gave it to the church. Naturally, this caused enmity and bitterness, which was nurtured by the blood of several generations who had been killed in what was an endless struggle between the MacCarthys and the O'Briens, as they both tried to dominate each other. For example, Diarmaid, the king of Desmond in 1177, his own father Cormac had been assassinated by the O'Briens, who had hired two of his household guards to turn on him. You can only imagine how important then such a feud was to a man like Diarmaid. It was everything. Nothing compared to it, except perhaps one other struggle that would also play a major role when the Normans arrived, an internal family dispute within Diarmaid's family, the MacCarthys. Now Diarmid, like almost every other single king in Gaelic Ireland, had to fight his way to the top to become king. All adult males whose grandfather had been king had the right to make a claim, so this led to constant battles and attempted coups. For a king to succeed, he would often have to exile, mutilate, and even kill brothers, uncles, and cousins along the way. Indeed, when Diarmaid's father had been assassinated by the O'Briens in 1138, his uncle, Donogh, took power and Diarmaid had to flee for his life. However, his uncle died, being taken prisoner by the O'Briens, in 1144, and Diarmaid grasped this opportunity with both hands, becoming king. Even though he did succeed in dominating Desmond and engaging in a long war with the age-old enemy, the O'Briens, he was never free from challengers within his own family. In 1161, his cousin Donal rose up against him, and Diarmaid responded by executing him. 3 years later, in 1164, Donal's son was executed as well. Such vicious family disputes were a way of life, though, in medieval Ireland, and to succeed engaging in such fratricidal violence was just par for the course. Such feuds, though, were all-consuming, and when the Normans arrived, they dictated how Gaelic families in Munster would react. Their eye was not necessarily on repelling the Normans per se, but more on looking to see if they could use the Normans to get ahead in these ancient feuds. This led to some highly unusual alliances in Munster when the Normans arrived, as we shall see next. The arrival of the Normans in Ireland in the late 1160s initially changed little in Munster. Diarmaid MacCarthy, in an attempt to preserve his power, initially opposed them, an understandable move, no doubt spurred on by the fact that his bitter rival, the King of Thomond, Donal O'Brien, was a brother-in-law to Strongbow's wife. However, with the arrival of King Henry II, with a massive army in 1171, Diarmaid changed his policy. Always focused on his bitter rival, Diarmaid feared Henry II might help Donal O'Brien. So, he met the king and submitted to him, hoping to gain his protection. In the following years, Diarmaid generally maintained good relations with the Normans, no doubt buoyed on by the fact that his rival Donal O'Brien rose up against them in 1174. Now this policy paid off for Diarmaid. In 1176, when he was deposed by his own son in yet another interminable family dispute, the Norman leader, Raymond de Gros, was on hand to intervene and restore him to power. By 1177, therefore, Diarmaid had shown guile and survived through a period that many other kings didn't. He had bent the knee when he needed, and he had fought when he had needed. No doubt he had good reason to be hopeful for the future, given that he had been loyal to the Normans, and had little reason to suspect that they would attack him. However, as we saw in the last episode, King Henry II had gathered some of the major Norman leaders at Oxford in England in May 1177 and decided on a new aggressive strategy in Ireland. There would be no reward for loyalty for Gaelic kings. Henry was now interested in wholesale conquest. Henry's logic was based on an increasingly long-term strategy where he was hoping someday to install his young son, John, as King of Ireland. To do this, John would need loyal supporters, and in this context, Diarmaid could never really be trusted. So Henry granted the kingdom of Desmond to Robert Fitzstephen and Milo de Cogan. However, while Diarmaid was to lose out, so too was his bitter rival Donal O'Brien, as Thomond was granted to another Norman, Philip de Brioche. After Oxford, rather than conquer their new lands individually, Robert Fitzstephen, Philip de Brioche and Milo de Cogan joined their forces, agreeing to conquer Munster together as one army. In Munster, Diarmaid presumably initially had little idea that this army was being assembled. If this had been a modern invasion, he would have known instantaneously once Henry had granted the lands at Oxford. But in the 12th century, there was no Sky or Fox News to have 24-hour, round-the-clock countdown to war, so he probably hadn't a clue. Now initially, nothing happened. De Brioche, Fitzstephen and de Cogan didn't leave England for a few months. Raising troops and preparations for the mission took planning, and they did not board ship until November 1177. Perhaps the first inkling Diarmid may have had that something was about to happen was when the Norman fleet landed at Waterford. The disembarkation of hundreds of soldiers was worrying for all kings in the south of Ireland, but it didn't take long for the Norman intentions to become clear. Leaving Waterford, the Norman army pushed westward into Desmond through Lismore. While we might think this would trigger immediate resistance, it's important to remember the Munster the people of the 12th century had grown up in, one of the violent feuds I mentioned earlier. These experiences had shaped people as they grew up, and now shaped their responses to the Normans. In this context, for Diarmid, the prospect of mounting resistance to the invasion was easier said than done. He not only had to be concerned with the invaders, but also his internal family enemies and Donal O'Brien in Thomond to his north. Time would prove he had good reason to be concerned. As the Norman army moved west from Waterford, they were guided by none other than Diarmid's own relation, Muirchertach McCarthy, a man who was probably his first cousin. This might seem like the worst kind of treachery to us. Diarmid was being stabbed in the back by his own relative. However, if you put yourself in Muirchertach's shoes in 1177, just for a moment, this might not seem like such a strange move. Muirchertach, like Diarmid, was raised in a society where the highest achievement was to become king. No doubt many of his close kinsmen had been killed trying to do so. Worse still for Muirchertach, his line of the McCarthy family had not held the kingship in 2 generations, which meant that they would lose the right to make a claim if he or his brothers didn't rise to the top. There was a lot of weight on the man's shoulders. So, in a world where it meant everything to become king, Muirchertach saw the approaching Normans as a way for him to achieve this ultimate goal. With his own house already divided, Diarmid McCarthy, however, soon faced another somewhat more predictable problem while he thought about what to do about the approaching Normans. Donal O'Brien, who clearly had no idea his own kingdom of Thomond was also part of the Norman war aim, swept over the frontier of Desmond, attacking McCarthy lands in their hour of desperation. Again, just like Diarmid's treacherous relatives, before we rush to condemn Donal, it's worth putting ourselves in his shoes for just a minute. It would be a major mistake to think that Donal somehow shared some natural affinity with Diarmid McCarthy because they were both Gaelic Irish kings. In fact, if anything, the opposite was the case. As we saw earlier, these men despised each other with a level of intense hatred that was unparalleled. Sure enough, neither had much love for the Normans, but such animosity paled in comparison to the depth of hostility they had for each other. Therefore, once the Normans attacked Diarmid McCarthy from the west, Donal O'Brien's decision to take advantage of this was almost instinctive. However, the impact this would have was obviously huge. Faced with the Norman army being aided by his own relatives to the east, and Donal O'Brien pouring over his border to the north, Diarmid McCarthy had little chance of mounting any meaningful resistance, and the Norman host successfully made its way to the town of Cork, already ruled by the Norman governor Richard of London. Diarmid McCarthy now realised the writing was on the wall. He knew fighting would only see him deposed. This was intolerable, so instead he sued for peace with the Normans, but this would be a costly peace. In a dominant position, the army of Philip de Brioche, Robert Fitzstephen and Milo de Cogan forced Diarmid to hand over vast tracts of territory. Milo de Cogan took 4 cantreds of land to the west of Cork, while Robert Fitzstephen took 3 to the east of the settlement. While this might not sound like much, it amounted to tens and tens of thousands of acres. Diarmid was allowed to hold the remaining 24 cantreds in Desmond, but he had to pay Fitzstephen and de Cogan for the pleasure. The first step to dominating the southwest of Ireland had been achieved by the Normans, but that said, the conquest was by no means complete. The Normans had taken the kingdom of Desmond in a relatively bloodless advance, but this did not mean there was no resentment. However, for the moment at least, in 1177, the Normans did not face any concerted threat, and they were able to launch the second phase of their campaign. Fitzstephen had gotten his reward, as had Milo de Cogan, with the lands in Desmond. Now the time for the reward of Philip de Brioche had come. This was, of course, Donal O'Brien's kingdom of Thomond. In accordance with the agreement, de Brioche, Fitzstephen and de Cogan now took their joint army north to attack O'Brien in Thomond. Donal O'Brien, however, was in a very different position to his great rival, Diarmuid MacCarthy. Although he probably didn't expect an attack so soon, he can only have known that at some point the Normans would invade his kingdom. He had repeatedly attacked them through 1175 and 1176. Nevertheless, the Norman advance into O'Brien's territory was not opposed, and they headed for the town of Limerick. There they would be able to use the walled settlement as a safe base of operations to conquer the surrounding territory. The last Norman in Limerick had been Raymond le Gros in 1176, and the town had been burned when he left. However, it seemed that Donal O'Brien had rebuilt it in the intervening year. Facing no major opposition until they arrived at Limerick, the Normans now faced the same situation that Raymond le Gros had years earlier, in that Limerick was one of the best defended towns in Ireland. Built on an island in the River Shannon, they would first have to wade through the river before they could mount an assault. Dangerous as this was, Raymond le Gros had proved it could be done. But in 1177, the citizens of Limerick did not wait for the Norman assault to begin. While Philip de Brioche, Robert Fitzstephen and Milo de Cogan strategised about how they would take the town, they suddenly found the rug pulled from beneath them when the settlement was set ablaze. The population, fleeing, decided the best defence was simply to destroy the fortification that the Normans so desperately wanted. This act had a dramatic impact on Philip de Brioche, the man who had been granted the kingdom of Thomond. While Fitzstephen and de Cogan did offer to stay and help him build a fortification on the site of Limerick, the population's willingness to destroy their own town rattled him. It made him think twice about having to hold a castle there in future. Alone and far from other Norman help, he could well meet a gruesome end. Understandably, de Brioche decided he would withdraw. For Donal O'Brien, he was lucky, for the time being at least. Nevertheless, Gaelic Thomond was on borrowed time. The grant of King Henry II had been made. This was not something that would be revoked, and the Normans would return. Nevertheless, by the end of what had been a moderately successful campaign, it was clear the Norman noose in Ireland was tightening. This was largely because of the inescapable tensions and feuds within Gaelic Ireland, tensions that existed in almost every kingdom. This did not augur well for the future. In Desmond, while they had not settled the land with colonists yet from England, and indeed would face staunch opposition in years to come, the Normans nevertheless now had a toehold. Indeed, while these events were unfolding in the southwest in 1177, in Meath, the Norman lord of the region, Hugh de Lacy, was illustrating what could be done from a similar toehold. Tune into the next episode when we look at Hugh de Lacy's exploits as the Norman invasion intensifies. We'll also check in on John de Courcy in Ulster. Until next time, Slán.